My son described psychosis pretty much like you do. You're further in your recovery. How did you get this far? There are a few variables in how I've been able to recover, and those are lived experience, relating with others, understanding their experiences, having it validated, going through therapy, having a support network of people, having people who understand it well enough to help me, pretty much a lot of support. Support goes a long way. First of all, I have been out of psychosis for 2 or 3 years. I came out of my last episode, like 3 years ago, like right at the beginning of the pandemic. And wow, it is really weird to be psychotic at the beginning of a pandemic. Let me tell you, that makes for some strange delusions. But I've essentially been out of psychosis for, 3 years. And that has given me enough time to do some healing, to make sense of what happened. And initially coming back into reality, like going through that recovery, it's very hard to accept reality and accept what didn't happen and what did happen. So it took a long time, about 18 months, for my mind to be restored. Aside from my mind being restored to the point that I had my cognitive abilities back and I could function as I had before, I had a lot of trauma to work through, and it was very hard to talk about. I started meeting people who were open about their experiences with schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, and having an outlet of being able to talk with people who related, who had healed beyond I had, helped me to get there too. And through their help and their conversations, I could feel less shame about myself, process what had happened, and be validated that that happened to you too. Okay, so I'm not crazy for what happened to me because I'm not alone. I also have the lived experience of having gone through 5 separate psychotic episodes. My episodes cumulatively racked up to maybe 3 years total across those 5 episodes. One of my episodes was over a year long. The others were anywhere between like 6 and 9 months long. So I'm not really sure just how long, but it spanned years. And this was over the course of 10 years. So a lot of my life was just in and out of psychosis. And I think you learn a lot about yourself going in and out like that. Like you learn what not to do, like go off your meds. I did that. That was a bad idea, and now I know better. I learned a lot about myself because it's a very revealing experience. Like you see some really dark parts of yourself that you don't want to look at and you can't help but look at. So I just have a lot of self-awareness now. Like I can identify better that didn't really happen, because I know now, like I've had this happen enough times that I can tell that actually wasn't real. Whereas the first couple episodes, I couldn't go through my memories and find out what actually happened. I had to have it happen more and more times before I knew what I was looking at. So I have a lot of self-awareness. I am constantly processing. I think that's actually a character flaw, because I cannot stop processing things. Like I know a goal in therapy that a lot of people have is to process through their grief and emotions and trauma to get to a point where they have finished processing. I just can't stop. So I am constantly introspecting and internalizing and dissecting things to make sense of it to a deeper level. And these levels just keep going. So there will never be a point where I'm satisfied with how much I've revealed about myself. So I am constantly processing. And this, I think, is why I'm so articulate in what I say and why I can come up with metaphors and analogies so easily, because I have looked at it from every angle to try to explain to people what I've been through. Not even like because of TikTok, because all my life I've just had this deep want and need to be understood. And having gone through something so understandable, I've always been thinking, well, how could I make this make sense to someone else? And in doing that, I've made sense of it for myself. So I have some self-validation and validation from others and support from others and understanding from others, people in my life who know now that I have psychosis that didn't. They have helped a lot because they've been educated, so they know the signs and they know what to look for. But at the beginning, no one knew, so no one could help me. And that's why my episodes would last over a year. Now I've been able to like have my last episode cut short before it got really, really bad because my fiance identified it. He had never actually seen me psychotic, unlike the other people in my life, but he had heard enough from me that he could tell that that's what was happening. So I've spared myself a lot of misery just by having this insanely amazing support system. Also, I'm a nerd for psychology, and I always have been ever since I learned what mental illness is back in high school. I thought I might have bipolar. I don't. But there's a lot of similarities between what I have, schizoaffective and bipolar. So I was onto something and I started learning about it. And then I started having worse mental illness and found out that not only did I like learning about what I was going through, I just liked learning about the brain in general. So I know a lot about personality disorders, specifically cluster B personality disorders, and a little bit about cluster A personality disorders. I know a lot about schizophrenia and schizoaffective, obviously. I know a fair bit about PTSD and CPTSD and the differences between those two. And I'm working on like educating myself about OCD currently because I'm very interested in OCD and I have loved ones with OCD. So I never stop really absorbing this stuff. Like I'm constantly learning about psychology in general and how the brain works. And this has led me down like really niche paths of learning about the Fragoli delusion, Cotard's delusion, Cagrad delusion, which are all delusions I've talked about the 4 types of delusions, about the 5 types of schizophrenia. And there's a lot I want to share on this channel because there's so much knowledge out there that I just want everyone to have. So the culmination of all of these facets of my recovery, the education, the self-awareness, the validation, the support, the therapy, they have brought me to a place where I'm functional. I'm high functioning, and that's really cool. I'm essentially in remission, and I will probably stay in remission because I now know how to take care of this disorder. I'm well aware at this point of what to do and what not to do, especially if I'm coming into psychosis. So I've got a battle plan at this point, and that's only because I went through 10 years and 5 episodes of hell to get to the point where I could actually heal. Can you talk more on what you mean by restoring your mind/cognitive abilities? Yes, absolutely. So basically the recovery phase of a psychotic episode is the time when your mind is healing because it does go through a lot of massive overhaul changes and there's even brain damage involved. So for me, coming into the recovery phase of my worst episode, I actually couldn't think, like not even possible. And that is really hard for people to comprehend because most people think all the time. And when you can't think, you can't even think, I want to think, but you have feelings. And for me, I would feel this massive loss of I can't use my head and I can't verbalize even to myself what the fuck is going on. So the first thing for me to restore was just the ability to think. And it really is a complete absence of thought. You know, I could observe things around me. I could see trees and logically know that it was a tree, but I couldn't think to myself, I am looking at a tree. All that came up was this frustration and struggle that there was nothing there. Once I was able to think, I had to relearn things like talking. I think this is partly because of catatonia, which is a symptom of psychosis in which you are just not really there. You're like checked out. There is nothing going on. So you a lot of times are just kind of frozen in positions, or for me, I couldn't talk. And with like the absence of thought on top of that, there was nothing for me to say. I couldn't think of a sentence, so I couldn't talk. And I actually had a friend who helped me through that by asking me every day if I would share a story, and I couldn't, but she kept asking until I did relearn enough speech that I could verbalize what was going on in here. A lot of times the only thing I could really respond to was yes or no questions because it was just too hard to conceptualize words, to frame them in a sentence, to speak beyond a sentence and have a train of thought that extended beyond that. My mind was very slow. I really had to like struggle to understand each word that was coming out of my mouth. So it was really hard just to talk. Then I came to a place where I understood that I had been psychotic, because up until that point, I didn't know that I was psychotic, and I didn't know what psychosis was, even though outside of psychosis, I do know what that is, and I do know I have a psychotic disorder. But in psychosis, I didn't know that that was what was happening to me. So there was a phase of like acceptance where I had to accept what was real and what wasn't real. And it was so hard to let go of things that had been like concretely real to me that I could not deny. And all of a sudden, it had to be hammered into me that you don't even get a choice in your reality anymore. This is what's real. This is what everybody believes in. This is what we all share as a reality, and you're part of it. I didn't want to be part of it, and I did not want to accept reality for what it is, but I had no choice. And so I had to let myself believe what everyone else believed. That was very, very hard for me to believe. And going back to beliefs that I'd had before that I had thought were false beliefs, because wouldn't you know, the delusions to me were reality itself. And I had to like re-go through basic existential stages that everybody goes through, like in childhood development around, I don't know, like age 9 or 10 or so, children begin to like accept their mortality. That's pretty young compared to now. I'm 30, and I had to go back to that basic life like lesson that I would die someday. And this was new to me because I thought I was immortal. So grappling with my newfound fear of death was maybe the hardest for me, because I honestly never thought I was going to die. And now I'm in a world where everybody's going to die. So yeah, accepting reality was really hard, and there's a lot of grief involved, grieving what happened to me, what I'd been through, the events that hurt me, people who had hurt me, the things I had done that had been harmful. And you just kind of have to grieve the loss of your own life. But back to the cognitive abilities. So like the restoring the mind is partly healing from trauma, partly accepting reality. And then the cognitive abilities for me took about 18 months for me to mostly get back. And there are things that I just never really restored. Like my reading comprehension level has plummeted. I never really got that back, but I am able to read again. I couldn't do that for a while. I couldn't write for a while. I know that sounds like extreme, but I had to relearn that stuff. I used to read a book in a day. Every day I read a lot, and now I can read a couple pages, and that's when I like can't understand what I'm reading anymore. So there were totally a lot of things that just went out the window. And though I got a lot of that stuff back, like I'm, more intelligent than I was going through the recovery phase, and I have a higher vocabulary than I did during the recovery phase, I don't have the intelligence I did before. I don't have the vocabulary I did before. I may never get all of these things back, but I'm really happy with the progress that I've made. And yeah, that is essentially what it takes to restore your mind and cognitive abilities coming out of a psychotic episode. So something happened yesterday that has been kind of bothering me, because it just goes to show how stigmatized certain mental illnesses are more than others. There has been so much progress made in the mental health community, and there's a lot more acceptance, there's a lot more awareness, there's a lot more education, there's a lot less stigma. But for certain disorders, say psychotic disorders or personality disorders that are looked at like they're ugly and undesirable, we still, those of us who have these disorders, carry a lot of stigma that is not going anywhere. I was at this recovery cafe that I go to, and it is for anyone recovering from anything. So, there's a lot of people who struggle with addiction and with mental illness. And I was hanging out in this group of people, and we were all talking about mental illness. And this one woman brought up that violence and mental illness are not one and the same, and that people with mental illness are not inherently violent, and that it's actually not all that common. And I chimed in and said, yeah, I'm not a violent person. I never have been. And so this doesn't apply to me at all, and I don't like this stigma. And this guy said, yeah, but you have psychosis. And he was pretty much implying that, okay, so it's true that it's not common for mental illness to be violent, but yours doesn't count. You're the exception because you have this ugly disorder that deserves that stigma because I buy into it, I think it's true, and you must be one of them. So on the one hand, you have this guy who's like accepting that mental illness is not inherently violent, and then turning to someone who has never shown him any sign of violence, who has never been anything but gentle and kind towards him, and saying, you don't count, you just don't. Like, that really gets to me, personally. I've noticed that this guy is uncomfortable around me, and I didn't know why. And now I think I may have an idea of why, because I'm very open about having a psychotic disorder. And ever since I started talking about it around him, he has been treating me differently. I just can't stand this idea that some mental illnesses are okay and they're acceptable and they're normal to have, and then these more severe ones like personality disorders and DID and OCD and psychosis are untouchable, they're gross, they're bad, like they're still so heavily stigmatized, whereas we've made so much progress, but there's still so much left to do. So I couldn't help feeling a little more hurt by his comment than I would by, say, someone on the internet, because this is someone in my personal life who I am in a support group with, who just doesn't see me for who I am. And I would love if people with psychosis could just be seen as people. A lot of times we don't get seen as people, and it can be like an experience where you're dehumanized, honestly. So to be lumped into this category of being inherently violent in a conversation about awareness and destigmatization is just not my cup of tea.